here at the home of Barbara Eichinger, and we just listened to a talk and a question and answer session with Dr. Ron Paul, who is an announced candidate for president for the Republican nomination anyways. And I'm standing here now with Senator Jim Forsythe, who is my state senator. He is also a freshman in the Senate, and you're also the chairman for the Ron Paul campaign here in New Hampshire. Thanks for taking a couple of minutes with us at GraniteGrok.
You're welcome.
Let me talk about the presidential election. Obviously, you're backing Dr. Ron Paul. You've been known for this since the last election cycle. Give us a couple of thoughts from your. I love saying this because I got to vote for a real rocket scientist. So from the brain of Jim Forsythe, tell me, why is it, or what is it that attracted you to Ron Paul, and why are you supporting him over any other candidate that's out there, including a couple other good Tea Party type of candidates?
So why I'm supporting Dr. Paul, what I like to talk about is, if you look at what we did in New Hampshire this year in the budget cycle, it's pretty historic. For the last 100 years, there's never been a budget decrease in New Hampshire except for once, and that was around 1%. So government just tends to grow larger and larger. We all agree that it's too big, but yet it always grows larger somehow. This year, New Hampshire finally did something about it and decreased the budget by over 11%. We have to have that happen at the federal level, but that hasn't happened. No matter who you get elected, Republican, Democrat, it hasn't happened. So we really need someone who has a long track record of standing up for the principle of limited government, someone who's always voted against increased spending, always voted for a balanced budget. And that's what we need, and Dr. Paul has done that. He's got a solid track record. He's really the only one running that I would consider that I have great confidence he would shrink the size of government. And we have to do that right now, because if you look at the amount of debt we have, it's on the level of Greece in terms of percentage of GDP, and you saw what happened to them. So we have to turn this around and do it now. The other thing too is he's really the one that has the best credibility on monetary policy. He understands the issue very deeply. And if you look at quantitative easing, you look at the increase in the monetary base of over $3 trillion over the last couple of years, I really think now that the credit bubble kind of collapses, coming to a close, but we've printed all this money, we're going to start to see some inflation. And he understands that. He knows what we need to do about it. He's the only candidate I figured can do that. And then the last thing we need for the economy is deregulation. And again, he's got a very solid track record of deregulation, which is something, a lot of Republicans are fiscally conservative, but when it comes to deregulating, they're often not so great. And he is somebody I trust to greatly decrease regulation.
You led up with the historic, and really it truly is a historic drop in the size of government here in New Hampshire. Only the second state in the union to do that this year. Was it enough? Give me your thoughts as a freshman New Hampshire state senator. Were your expectations met in some areas, not met in others? What do you think was some of the best stuff that the Senate turned out? And what were some of the things that, in your opinion, that the Senate kind of fumbled a little bit?
Well, you asked like 6 questions in there. So
I'm trying to give you a free field to play in.
The first question is, were the cuts enough? I would say the cuts were enough for this year, but we need to keep heading in this direction. But when you create programs and people come dependent on them, you can't just suddenly cut it. You've got to transition out of it. A good example of that is Medicaid managed care. So the Medicaid program is costing the state of New Hampshire a lot of money, and by putting forward the Medicaid managed care reforms, we should see that spending decreased and a lot of cost savings. But it takes a while for that to happen. So we hope to see the fruits of that, coming up. You look at reforms on the prison system, either privatization, privatization mainly. You can't do that all in one fell swoop. You've got to, study the program, figure out how to do it, and perhaps work into it gradually. But we need to keep at these things to keep going in that direction. When I ran, I talked about how at the state of New Hampshire we spend $8,000 per state and local. We spend $8,000 per person. So a family of 4, that's $32,000. That's too much, and that's we need to reduce that burden. But you have to do it smartly. You can't just blindly cut things. We're moving in the right direction. As long as we're moving in the right direction, I'm happy. And I expect that we'll continue to move in this direction as long as we keep reelecting the people we have this time. Let's see. Other question was disappointment in the Senate. Things that I'm proud of.
Yes.
I'm proud of the budget. I think the House put a very good budget together. I think there were some some sensitive programs that were cut by the House that the Senate worked to restore without really impacting the size of the budget. We came very close to the size of the House's budget by making some cuts in some other areas and restoring some funding in some that were kind of more critical in terms of need right now. And the thing I'm very proud of is we didn't downshift to the communities. That's something the governor did, and he really deserves to be, that needs to be talked about a lot more than it has been. School building aid, he cut to 40%. In other words, existing building aid projects that were promised money were only going to get 40% of their funding, and that was going to hit the property taxpayer. Catastrophic aid for special education, he cut to 0. Again, that was going to hit the property taxpayer because that's got to be made up by the property tax. State contribution to retirement was 25%. He cut that to 0. Again, that's a big hit to the property taxpayer. The House fixed most of that, and the Senate helped fix the rest. And the retirement reforms should, even though our state contribution has gone close to 0, because the retirement reforms, the property tax burden is not going to be increased because of the retirement package. And we put a clause, and there's a handful of people, including myself, that said we weren't going to vote for the budget unless we put something in the budget that said that the towns won't pay more than they did in 2011 towards retirement.
As an elected budget committee member here for the budget committee here in Guilford, my take on that is I see no reason why the towns shouldn't take on that burden, because it further pushes down the capability or the responsibility of those costs that are being borne by the local citizenry. But also, in taking on that additional cost, you ought to be able to have the additional capability of saying, and here's what the retirement makeup would be. So, for instance, moving from a defined benefit to a defined contribution is certainly high on a lot of people's mind, because there is that 25% makeup that now the local towns have to do. And again, removing some of the mandates that the state has put upon the towns as the political subdivisions, it would be nice to be able to say, let's unshackle that a little bit more. But I kind of interrupt you by that.
No, it's actually an excellent point, and I agree with you. You know, shifting the retirement contributions to locals, where you guys, the locals, are the employers, in some senses doesn't make a lot of sense. The problem is years ago, the state got the locals to adopt it by having a big state contribution towards it. I think it was 45% when first proposed. So it's, instead of doing your own retirement package and controlling it, let's us do it for you. We'll control it, and we'll help you out by putting this big contribution in. But then the contribution's been pulled away. So if you're going to pull away the contribution, you need to give the power back to the localities, like you said, in order to control that better. That's, in some senses, that's been done a little bit by the change in the composition of the retirement board. It's in the retirement reform packages. Yeah, but we could probably do more in that respect to give control back to the locals. We do need to shift to defined contribution plan. The problem is to do that you have to have the two systems in place at the same time, and you can't have an unfunded liability in one of the current system, because everybody would jump ship immediately. So there's actually federal laws that make sure your current pension system is fully funded before you can start an alternative. So we're kind of stuck in that regard. But the reforms that we made this year, and that was one of the things I was going to mention, the retirement reform is something I'm incredibly proud of. 19.5 out of the Senate, is fairly aggressive, very much helping the property taxpayer, and then at the same time keeping the system solvent for the retirees and being fair about it, doing some things. Current retirees really don't get affected. People coming close to retirement are affected very little, and you know, as you move further up the chain and there have been less promises made, then there's more of a shift of burden onto that. So
worst disappointment.
Worst disappointment, I guess, RGGI repeal. I wanted to see that repealed. I mean, the RGGI program is something where we take a little bit of money from a lot of people and give it to a few people. And economically, that doesn't make sense. And there was a lot of politically connected programs that got funded by that. So I would have really liked to see RGGI repealed. We had enough votes to do it, but not to override a veto. We had 15 people lined up that would vote for full repeal. We need 16 to override a veto. So because of that, an amendment was put forward to improve RGGI, and it does do that. There's some things where if the payments become too large, then the contributions get sent back to the ratepayers, and the money's going to something that's less politically controlled, an existing program for helping people improve their energy efficiency.
But you've outsourced the leadership issue in that you've now said we will be in RGGI only until some other state gets out. So we actually have put the capability to pull that ripcord into some other legislature's hand.
Yeah, well, and there's actually a logical reason for that, is because the way the RGGI system's set up, it's, all the states are tied together. So if a certain number of them get out, the program at that point becomes less and less viable, and so that's why that's in there. In the last, I was having this debate with somebody before. There's so many versions of the RGGI bill putting forward, either in the budget or tacked onto shoreline protection, because there's a lot of jockeying between the House and the Senate. The House really wanted a full repeal. I was certainly supporting them on that, so there, I don't know, but right at the end there was an amendment put forward by Senator Sanborn, because the version of the compromise bill, I'll call it, for RGGI, had us pull out if any state that was 10% or more of the total RGGI power load got out, then we'd get out. So that was amended to be 10%, any 10% or two states. But in the rewrite, it was 10% of the New England load and 2 states. 10% of the New England load is a very different figure than 10% of the overall load.
Indeed.
And so we actually wound up picked up Connecticut. I've looked at the numbers for this. We picked up Connecticut, and I don't know if this is public knowledge, but we picked up Connecticut and Rhode Island. If either of those single get out, then we get out as well.
Of course, now with New Jersey getting out, that would have been the 10%, and off we go.
Right, but we knew New Jersey was getting out, so the people that didn't want a RGGI repeal weren't willing to write it in such a way that New Jersey pulling us out would get us out.
Well, I promise to keep this quick.
Sure.
And Jim, I want to say thank you very much for taking a few minutes with GraniteGrok.
Thank you.
And we'll be in touch later on.
Yeah, maybe next week.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you.